Imagine a cold so heavy it feels like it presses down on your bones. 30 degrees below zero, seas turning to glass, winds screaming across the tundra like living things. In our modern world, if the grid fails, your warm home becomes a refrigerator in hours. Heat leaks through glass, concrete drains warmth from your feet. We battle winter with machines that lose every time the power goes out. But 1,000 years ago, in the brutal winters of Scandinavia, Iceland and Greenland, the Vikings had no electricity, no fiberglass insulation, no double-paned windows. And yet, they didn't freeze. Archaeology shows something astonishing. During blizzards that could kill a modern camper in minutes, Viking families sat inside their longhouses in what scholars describe as t-shirt temperatures. How is that possible? It wasn't magic, and it wasn't just a roaring fire. It was engineering, raw, elegant, survival-driven engineering carved from soil, timber and wind. Welcome to Historia Prime. Today we step inside the Viking longhouse to uncover the forgotten thermal technologies hiding in its walls, its floor, even its air. You'll see why a structure made of dirt, grass and bark outperformed many modern homes, and the lessons we can still use today to stay warm when the world outside turns white and merciless. Get comfortable, it's freezing out there, but in here, the old Norse secrets are about to light a fire under everything you thought you knew about winter survival. Part 1. The Aerodynamic Fortress. To understand why Viking homes never froze, we first need to understand the shape of the battlefield itself. Winter in the North Atlantic isn't just cold, it's an enemy. And if you build the wrong kind of shelter, the wind will tear it apart long before the frost does. Today, if you ask a child to draw a house, you'll get a simple square with a little triangle on top. But plant that same shape in the roaring winds of Scandinavia or Iceland, and it becomes a liability. A flat wall is a target. A box is a wind trap. Every gust slams into it, creating pressure that forces cold air through the tiniest gaps and strips heat away like a thief. The Vikings understood this instinctively because they were sailors before they were builders. They spent their lives watching how water flowed around a hull, how a curve could tame chaos. And when they built on land, they applied the same logic. They didn't build houses, they built grounded ships. If you look at the footprint of a Viking longhouse at places like Trelleborg or Borg, you'll notice something modern architects often overlook. The walls bow outward. They're curved, almost like the ribs of an overturned vessel. That shape wasn't artistic flair, it was survival physics. When gale-force winds strike a flat wall, the impact creates a brutal high-pressure zone that rams cold air straight into the structure. But when those winds meet a curved Viking wall, something remarkable happens. The air slides. It glides around the building. The pressure drops. The assault weakens. And the home loses far less heat. Wind tunnel studies show this shape reduces drag and aerodynamic pressure by up to 42%. That's not a minor improvement. That's the difference between a home staying warm and a home being hollowed out by the cold. To make this even more effective, the Vikings oriented their longhouses like ships sailing into a storm. The narrow ends faced the prevailing winds. The broad sides were sheltered. Their homes weren't passive victims of the weather. They were aerodynamic fortresses built to cooperate with the wind rather than fight it. By shaping their houses like boats, the Vikings engineered the first line of thermal defense. Before the fire was lit, before the walls were packed, before a single pelt or tapestry was hung, the wind itself had already been tamed. And that is how the battle for warmth truly began. Part 2. The battery in the walls. Now that the shape has done its first job and bent the wind away, we step closer to the Viking longhouse, and immediately something feels unusual. It doesn't rise like a house, it rises like a hill, a mound, a piece of the earth itself. And that is not a poetic metaphor, it is literal engineering. In Iceland and Greenland, timber was too precious to waste on thick structural walls. So the Vikings turned to the one material they had in abundance, the ground beneath their feet. They built with turf. But turf was not just dirt and grass. It was a deliberate, engineered composite created long before the word insulation ever entered human language. Modern homes rely on lightweight insulation, fiberglass, foam, fluffy materials designed to slow heat transfer. But these materials store almost no heat. The moment your furnace stops, your home begins to cool. The Vikings took a radically different path. They didn't try to trap heat, they tried to hold it. A Viking wall could be 6 feet thick at the base. Imagine slicing the earth into blocks, each one held together by tightly interwoven root systems, and stacking them in intricate herringbone patterns that locked the structure like a giant earthen puzzle. This wasn't primitive construction, this was thermal engineering. Here is the physics lesson modern architecture loves to forget. Insulation resists heat loss, but thermal mass stores heat. A lightweight insulated wall gets cold the moment the fire dies. But a thick dirt wall becomes a thermal battery. It charges during the day as the hearth burns, absorbing megajoules of heat into its dense mass. And when night falls, that same wall releases the warmth back into the room. Slowly, steadily, predictably. This phenomenon is called thermal inertia. It is the reason medieval turf homes cooled over days instead of hours. It's the reason Vikings could let their fires burn low at night without fear of freezing. They were living inside a rechargeable heater made of soil. But there was one more problem to solve. Wet insulation is dead insulation. If those walls soaked up rain, they would freeze into solid blocks of ice. So the Vikings turned to biology. The outer layer of the turf was alive. As the grass grew, its roots knit the wall tighter, reinforcing it like organic rebar. And more importantly, the living grass acted as a moisture pump, drawing excess water out of the structure. Over time, the wall actually became stronger, drier, and more stable. It was a living raincoat, one that repaired itself with every new season. So when you stand in a Viking longhouse, you're not standing in a hut. You're standing in the world's oldest passive heating system, crafted from dirt, roots, and physics so sound that modern eco-builders are rediscovering it today. In the battle against the Arctic, the walls weren't just barriers, they were batteries, and they ensured that even in the dead of winter, warmth never truly died. Part 3. The secret beneath the floor. Now look down, because this is where the Vikings quietly outclass even our modern homes. Today, the floor is often the coldest part of a house. Concrete slabs sit directly on the frozen earth, pulling heat from your feet like a thief in the night. Most of us don't even question it. We simply endure cold floors as an unavoidable part of winter. But the Vikings refused to accept that weakness. They understood something modern builders often overlook. Cold kills from the bottom up. And so, they engineered a floor that didn't just sit on the earth, it floated above it. Archaeological digs at places like York and Borgund have uncovered a multi-layered system so clever it feels almost futuristic. Yet it was built with nothing but stone, straw, wood, and insight. The first step was drainage. The Vikings didn't build directly on top of dirt. They excavated a pit, then filled it with stones and gravel. This wasn't random rubble, it was a capillary break. By severing the connection between soil moisture and the home above, they forced the ground to stay dry. And dry ground is always warmer than wet ground. Next came the thermal battery hidden beneath the floorboards. Archaeologists have found stones, granite, gabbro, dense materials capable of storing immense heat that show signs of repeated thermal shock. These stones were heated deliberately. Sometimes they were placed into trenches after glowing near the fire. Other times they sat beneath the hearth, charging slowly throughout the day. In both cases, the purpose was the same: to load the floor itself with stored warmth. Then came the organic shield. The Vikings layered straw, reeds, or even raw wool over the stones. These fibers trapped pockets of air, creating a natural insulation layer long before anyone coined the term R-value. This soft layer prevented heat from bleeding into the stones too quickly and kept the floor surface stable and dry. Finally, they added the breathable deck. They laid wooden planks, not sealed, not varnished, but loose and living. Wood that could breathe, wood that allowed warm air to circulate beneath it. This wasn't just a floor, it was a hovering platform, a thermal buffer zone, a protective layer that separated human bodies from the freezing earth below. And the result was astonishing. While the ground outside froze solid, the Viking floor remained a warm, dry surface, never icy, never damp, always radiating a quiet, gentle heat. They didn't just warm the air around them, they warmed the surfaces they touched. They engineered comfort at the level of human experience. So think about your own home. Think about stepping out of bed on a winter morning and recoiling from the icy sting of the floor. That discomfort is conductive heat loss, one of the most persistent winter problems we still haven't solved well. But the Vikings? They solved it 1,000 years ago with nothing more than stone, straw, and the wisdom to treat the floor not as an afterthought, but as the first line of defense against the cold. Part 4. The breathing hat, the roof. We've seen the walls. We've uncovered the secret beneath the floor. Now it's time to look up, because the Vikings knew that a warm home is only as strong as the lid that keeps the heat in and the cold out. A Viking roof wasn't a light, delicate structure. It was a giant weight, tons of earth, turf, and living grass, sitting on a timber frame so massive it looked more like the skeleton of a cathedral than the top of a rural home. A fully soaked turf roof could weigh as much as 5 small cars. Yet the Vikings built structures strong enough to hold it for generations. And then came the real brilliance: waterproofing without modern materials. No tar paper, no plastic sheets. Instead, they turned to the skin of the northern forest. Birch bark. They peeled it in wide sheets and layered it over the wooden boards like shimmering fish scales. Birch bark is naturally waterproof, naturally rot-resistant, and extraordinarily durable. It is one of nature's most reliable shields against moisture. On top of that, they stacked the sod. Layer after layer of turf formed a dense, living cap. Together, the bark and sod created something modern architects rarely consider: a breathing roof. Where modern roofs are sealed tight, so tight that trapped moisture leads to rot, mold, and decay, the Viking roof invited moisture to escape. Warm air rising from inside the home gently pushed water vapor upward. The sod allowed that moisture to migrate outward, where the wind carried it away. The entire roof acted like a giant lung, exhaling humidity before it could cause damage. And just when the engineering couldn't seem more elegant, winter handed them a final advantage. In our modern world, we shovel snow off our roofs as if it's a threat. The Vikings saw it differently. They let it accumulate, because snow is nearly 90% trapped air, and trapped air is insulation. A thick snowpack transformed the longhouse into a winter fortress. Every fresh snowfall added another free layer of protection. Every storm made the house warmer. The longhouse embraced winter, used it, partnered with it. The roof didn't just keep water out, it wrapped the home in a seasonal blanket. So when you look at a Viking home from above, you're not looking at a primitive hut. You're looking at a living heating system, a breathing hat, a design so efficient that many modern green roof architects are unknowingly rediscovering the exact same principles today. The Vikings didn't fight the environment. They collaborated with it, one birch sheet and one sod block at a time. Part 5. The Smoke Blanket. Step inside the longhouse and the world changes instantly. The first thing you notice isn't the heat, it's the smell. Wood smoke, pine tar, damp wool, and the unmistakable scent of human life packed together against the cold. The second thing you notice is the darkness. There are no windows carved into these walls because every window is a hole, and every hole is a thief that steals heat. The only light comes from the central hearth, the langildur, flickering like a heartbeat at the center of the room, and from a few small openings high above, called the leuras. Now look up. For most modern visitors, this is the moment of confusion. Where is the chimney? But there isn't one, and to the Vikings, adding a chimney would have been madness. Chimneys don't just vent smoke, they vent heat, drawing precious warmth upward and throwing it out into the icy darkness. Instead, the Vikings mastered a principle that modern HVAC experts spend entire careers studying: thermal stratification. The smoke rising from the hearth collected at the peak of the roof, forming a thick, hot layer of air, like a dark, shimmering cloud suspended just above everyone's heads. This wasn't a floor, it was a thermal shield. This smoke blanket did two extraordinary things. First, it acted like a lid on a pot. The dense, heated smoke slowed the escape of warm air, trapping radiant heat in the living zone below. Families sat, worked, and slept in that warm, breathable pocket, protected from the freezing chaos outside. Second, the smoke constantly coated the roof timbers with soot and creosote. While that sounds messy, it was a natural preservative. It killed insects. It prevented decay. It turned the entire upper structure into a self-maintaining, smoke-cured shell. In a sense, the house was seasoning itself like a cast-iron pan, growing stronger with every winter. And despite the intimidating cloud above, the Vikings controlled it with precision. Using the leuras, roof vents that could be opened or tightened with long poles, they could raise or lower the smoke layer. Too smoky? Crack the vent. Too cold? Close it and trap the heat. It was a manual climate control system 1,000 years before thermostats existed. Of course, this came with a price. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking lungs paid dearly for this heating method. But when the alternative is freezing to death in an Arctic storm, you accept the cough and choose to live. In the end, the smoke blanket wasn't just a survival hack. It was a thermal strategy, a way to use the physics of rising heat not just to warm a home, but to maintain it, protect it, and keep generations alive in a place where the environment rarely gives second chances. Part 6. The Biological Furnace. The fire in the center of the longhouse wasn't the only source of warmth. In fact, one of the Vikings' greatest heating systems didn't burn wood at all. It walked on 4 legs. If you follow the long central aisle toward one end of the hall, you'll hear it before you see it. Slow, rhythmic chewing, the creak of hooves on straw, the steady breath of large animals resting in the dark. This is the byre, the indoor stable built directly into the longhouse itself. To modern sensibilities, the idea of living under the same roof as cows, sheep, and goats sounds messy, smelly, even unthinkable. But the Vikings weren't designing for aesthetic comfort. They were designing for survival. And the truth is, animals are radiators. They always have been. A single dairy cow weighing around 1,000 pounds generates 600 to 1,000 watts of heat continuously. That means one cow is basically a free space heater running all day, every day. Now imagine 10 of them. Imagine an entire stable of warm-bodied creatures releasing heat into the structure throughout the night, while Arctic winds blast outside. The Vikings didn't let this gift escape. They engineered the byre slightly lower than the living quarters so that the rising heat from the animals drifted naturally upward, warming the family's sleeping platforms. It was a beautifully simple exchange. Humans gave the animals shelter. The animals returned the favor with heat. The longhouse wasn't a home, It was a symbiotic thermal machine. Yet the biological engineering didn't stop there. Many Viking homes were built on settlement mounds, essentially layers of old structures, buried debris, and generations of organic waste. Deep within these mounds, decomposition continued long after the visible world forgot what was buried there. And decomposition releases heat. As organic matter breaks down, it undergoes exothermic reactions, the same physics that makes a compost pile steam in winter. Beneath some longhouses, that slow fermentation released a gentle, steady warmth that radiated upward into the floors. It wasn't hot enough to replace the hearth, but it was enough to keep the earth beneath the home from freezing solid. So the Vikings harnessed 3 heat systems at once: the fire in the center, the animals at the far end, and the earth itself working silently below. They created a living ecosystem of warmth, powered by biology, physics, and clever design. While modern homes rely almost entirely on external energy, the Vikings built structures that generated, stored, and recycled heat through the very life that filled them. In a world where winter punished every weakness, they turned nature into an ally and survived because of it. Part 7. The Social Reactor. We've explored the physics, the biology, and the engineering. But there is one final element that made the Viking longhouse warm enough to outsmart Arctic winters. And it wasn't built from timber or stone. It was built from people, because you did not survive a Viking winter alone. Step inside a longhouse and look along the walls. You'll see raised wooden platforms called palla. These were not just beds, they were workstations, dining benches, social hubs, and, most importantly, thermal platforms. The Vikings understood something our modern houses often ignore. The coldest air always settles on the floor. Even with a floating floor and warm stones beneath it, the ground remains the first place the cold attacks. By lifting themselves several feet off the ground, the Vikings stepped into what we might call the Goldilocks zone, a band of air that was neither freezing at their feet nor smoky at the roof. It was the level where heat naturally stabilized, and they designed their daily lives to unfold right there. And then came the human factor. They slept close. They worked close. They leaned shoulder to shoulder, not out of affection, though affection surely lived there, but out of thermal logic. A human body is a radiant heater, constantly releasing warmth. 10 bodies together produce more heat than a modern electric furnace on low power. The Vikings created what we could call social heating, turning community itself into a survival engine. But the wisdom didn't stop at proximity. The Vikings used textiles as part of their architecture. Heavy woolen tapestries and animal skin curtains hung along the turf walls. These tapestries were not decorations, they were thermal shields. Behind each one lay a pocket of dead air, a still layer that blocked radiant cold from leaking into the living space. This was the same principle behind modern insulated clothing, but stretched across entire walls. The longhouse became a layered system, each layer buying time, each layer protecting the next. First the snow outside, then the turf wall, then the tapestry, then the clothing, and finally the person. A nested sequence of barriers, each capturing warmth and slowing the advance of cold. All of it together transformed the longhouse from a building into a thermal organism, one that breathed, circulated heat, and relied on its community to stay alive. In the end, Viking survival wasn't only about engineering structures, it was about engineering behavior. The longhouse forced cooperation, demanded closeness, and rewarded unity. It turned a group of individuals into a reactor of shared warmth. And in the dead of a Nordic winter, that simple truth, you survive together or not at all, was perhaps the most powerful heating system they ever invented. Part 8. Conclusion. The lesson. So after all of this, why did Viking homes never freeze, even in the kind of winters that could kill a modern camper in a single night? It wasn't because they had advanced technology. It wasn't because they were stronger, tougher, or somehow magically resistant to cold. It was because they understood the enemy better than we do. They didn't try to overpower winter with sheer energy. They didn't blast heat into their homes or chase a thermostat up and down the wall. Instead, they worked with the cold. They let snow become insulation. They shaped their walls to slip through the wind. They used the earth not as an obstacle, but as a battery. They turned animals into heaters, and they even let smoke become part of the thermal system. Every element of their environment became a tool. Every challenge became an advantage. The truth is, the Vikings didn't build homes that sat on the landscape. They built homes that belonged to the landscape, structures that breathed, adjusted, and cooperated with nature rather than resisting it. In a world where energy was precious and winter was merciless, they engineered survival by understanding the physics of their surroundings at the deepest level. And now, 1,000 years later, we are slowly rediscovering what they already knew. We call it passive house design. We call it green roofing. We call it earth-sheltered architecture. Yet the core ideas are the same ones Vikings implemented with nothing more than turf, birch bark, and a keen sense of observation. So the next time you hear the wind howling outside and your instinct is to crank the thermostat a little higher, think back to the longhouse. Think about snow as a blanket, walls as batteries, and floors that float above the cold. Think about how the storm outside isn't something to fight, but something to design around, something to outthink. And maybe, in some small way, you'll borrow a lesson from the Norse. Not to overpower winter, but to outsmart it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient survival engineering, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps the algorithm warm up. And if you want more forgotten knowledge that could reshape the way you live today, make sure to subscribe to Historia Prime. Let me know in the comments, could you survive a winter in a longhouse with 10 cows and no chimney? Or would the smoke blanket send you running outside into the snow? Until next time, stay warm.